Thanks, Elizabeth. All right, so we are now recording. Almost did that again. All right, so I guess let me back up for a second. So we're talking about price discrimination. Price discrimination is a mechanism whereby producers charge different prices to different individuals for the same price. So the example that I used was talking about airline travel. So we can segment. We can charge different prices to business class versus vacationers, right? And what we're trying to do is determine. Sorry, I'm going to repeat myself so this is on the video. Is trying to determine the willingness to pay. People who are less price sensitive are going to have inelastic demand curves. People who are price sensitive are going to have elastic demand curves. The result is people who are inelastic, if you have a small decrease in price, you're going to get a small increase in quantity. Whereas for people with elastic demand curves, a small decrease in price will result in a large increase in quantity. Right, and so the example we talked about in particular was airline travel. So vacationers tend to be relatively elastic in their demand. So when the price of airline travel falls, vacationers take more airline-based vacations, whereas business travelers who are going someplace for a meeting don't care that much about what the price of the flight is because they're not going for fun, they're going for business. And so small changes in price aren't going to make business travelers travel a whole lot more. Thank you for pointing that out. If you see that in the future, please let me know. I get wound up in talking and I forget to turn the recording back on. Okay, so in order to engage in price discrimination, you need two things. A producer needs to be able to do two things. Number one is they need to be able to actually engage in segmentation. So we talked about, discriminating between business travelers versus vacationers, between men and women, maybe between urban and rural people. And, we can go all the way down to the individual level. And we talked about how universities do engage in price discrimination by using the FAFSA to reveal every bit of financial information about you so that they can determine just how high they can actually price tuition. And then they use things like scholarships. They set an extremely high price for tuition, and then they back off from that price by offering you so-called scholarships, which are really just their recognition that your willingness to pay will be lower than what their list price is. Okay, so I don't want to make any of you feel bad who maybe got scholarships. I'm sure you deserve them, but this is a technique that every college engages in. Okay, so I said we've got to be able to engage in segmentation. So the producer needs to be able to meaningfully sort out people who have different preferences, and then they need to be able to prevent arbitrage. So have any of you ever gone to a concert or a sporting event and been approached by a scalper as you're like heading toward the stadium or the concert hall, and they're like trying to sell you tickets for the event? Yeah, okay. So scalpers are engaged in arbitrage, right? So they as long as they're scalpers and not scammers in the sense that they've got fake tickets, right? Scalpers, what they'll do is they'll buy tickets early as if they were going to go to the game or go to the concert, and then they will hold those tickets up until the last second, and they'll stand right outside the concert or right outside the garden with as the Bruins are getting ready to play, and they'll be like, hey, got tickets for tonight, anybody need tickets, and when you're like, yeah, I need two, and they're like, they'll be like, oh yeah, these are going to be like $85 each, right? When he actually paid like 25 or 35 or something like that, right? So what they're counting on, what they're trying to do is they're buying something cheap, right? They buy something cheap, and then they allow you and not you probably, because you probably didn't buy the tickets, but what they know is there will be some people who are counting on scalpers to be there who have a very high willingness to pay, right? And so they show up, they're really desperate to go to the game, right, or go to the concert. They're desperate enough that they don't have a ticket and they've shown up anyway. So they show up and they're willing to pay you know, a higher premium than what the scalper had to pay when they bought it just on a, you know, just on a regular day, a regular price. So in order to, so that is an example of arbitrage. The scalper paid a low price and now moves it from one market segment, the people who, you know, were relatively, who had relatively elastic demand. Those are the people who would have bought the ticket in advance at the low prices, and they're moving it from the low willingness to pay segment to the high willingness to pay segment. And they're able to identify those people because those people are the people who show up and still want to go to the concert but don't have a ticket. So they engage, their scalpers are an example of arbitrage. Another example of arbitrage is, and I've posted some stuff about this, is this idea of re-importation of drugs, right? So re-importation, it's kind of a weird word, and some people argue that that's kind of a garbage word, but the idea, what it represents is, you know, last time we were talking about, you know, like drugs like Lipitor or Viagra, you know, they're brand name drugs, they're sold in the United States. You know, in the United States, we pay higher prices for our drugs than Canada does, right? So Canada negotiates, the government negotiates for the for a national formulary, and basically everybody's on Medicare is how I understand, you know, Canada, and everybody pays kind of the same price for drugs. And so if you're an American citizen, you could cross the border, right? You drive up to Quebec, cross the border, go to a Canadian pharmacy, and you could buy Viagra or Lipitor for maybe, you know, half of the price that you could buy it in the United States. So you could drive across the border, buy you know, buy your Viagra or buy your Lipitor, and you know, buy your Viagra, buy your Lipitor at say half price, and then come back, you know, into the United States and use it there. That's a example of re-importation for personal use. So the idea here is the drug was made in the United States, it was sent to Canada, right, and it's sold in and it's being sold in Canada. You are a United States citizen. You are driving up to Canada, buying the drug in Canada, and bringing it back. What you are doing is you're crossing from the highly inelastic market into the elastic market, right? So you're crossing segments, and you're buying in the low price segment and coming back, right? And so the pharmaceutical companies don't like this. They really don't like it if you go over there and buy large quantities of their drugs that they manufactured in the United States, sold wholesale into Canada. And then if you go up there and buy you know, not just buy for personal consumption, but you buy and with the intent to sell, right? So you import what had been exported, hence the phrase re-importation, right? That is actually technically illegal. So it's sketchy about whether you are violating the law by going across the border and buying drugs and then bringing them back, even for personal use. But it is definitely against the law for you to go to Canada, buy drugs that were manufactured in the United States, in Canada, bring them back to the United States and sell them. I posted a couple of articles about that on the Chapter 14 module. So if you want to have a look at those, that's a hot topic, or has been a hot topic for a number of years in the health economics world. So it's illegal. It violates the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, right? And so let's look at what that, you know, kind of what that looks like. Okay, so imagine we have a US market. First of all, we're a really big market, so we have more demand because we're big. And then we also have a lot of private insurance, which makes us more inelastic, right? Because we don't pay for our, we pay for our health insurance, but you don't, you and your parent or your parents tend not to actually pay, like, for each visit you go, you don't pay, you don't pay, the full price. The insurance company is paying most of the fee-for-service cost. So if you have insurance, you are going to be, relatively speaking, relatively inelastic with respect to your demand for healthcare. So same applies to pharmaceuticals. So this is the US, this is Canada, right? So we look at our marginal revenue, right? Our demand, marginal revenue, demand, right? And let's assume, right? So this is a drug, let's say Lipitor, because I don't want to be creepy and talk about Viagra all the time. But let's say Lipitor is a drug being manufactured in the United States, and the marginal cost of manufacturing the drug, whether it's being sold in the United States or Canada, is going to be the same, right? It's the same drug being made in the same factory, and it's just being shipped to Canada as opposed to being shipped to Boston. So the marginal cost is going to be the same. So this is demand US, demand Canada, right? So the marginal cost in the US and the marginal cost Canada is the same. So in order to find the profit maximizing quantity and price, this is a monopolistic model. So we're going to look where marginal cost crosses marginal revenue. That's right here and right here. Right? Draw a little line down to quantity. So this is going to be QM. Right? Draw a line up and over, and we get, so let's say PUS, then rather than M, let's say US, and then draw a line up and over, P Canada, right? Q Canada. Didn't draw that well. I should have made this a little smaller because they're a smaller country. So it winds up looking like they're going to get a bigger quantity, but they really shouldn't because the US is a bigger market. So don't mind my quantities, but the point, really the takeaway point is, for the same drug, right? Literally, it's the same drug. Literally, it costs the company the same amount of money to make the drug, is sold for a higher price in the US than it is in Canada. Right? Because our market is more inelastic, we're less price sensitive than Canada is. And I should have drawn Canada smaller as well, but didn't do a good job with that. Okay, so what are we doing? We're segmenting, right, between the US and Canada. So yes, we can segment, right? So can pharmaceutical companies engage in price discrimination? Yes. They can engage in geographic price discrimination, and they probably engage in some other things as well, like they change, the new improved Lipitor, right, which is just like the old Lipitor, but it's blue instead of pink. Right? So they charge more for the new improved Lipitor, or it has new cherry flavor, right? But it's essentially the same drug. Right? But they're able to charge more because in the price in the inelastic market, people don't care; they just pay. Now the other question is, can you prevent arbitrage? Right? Well, for the most part, you can. The only people, and the reason you can is because the drug companies got Congress to pass a law saying that it's illegal, right, for a pharmacy to go across the border and buy U.S. drugs manufactured in the U.S. that have been exported to Canada. It is illegal for CVS to go across the border and buy drugs in Canada and then bring them back to the United States again and sell them, right? or some mom and pop. I think one of you guys works in a pharmacy. So so your mom and pop pharmacy that maybe you work for, it is illegal for them to buy drugs from Canada that were made in the US and exported to Canada. It is illegal for them to re-import them back. That is illegal. So in terms of preventing arbitrage, the pharmaceutical industry got Uncle Sam on their side and uses the federal government to prevent that from happening. So it's a federal crime, right, for you to engage in arbitrage in any meaningful way. If you live in New Hampshire and you live if you live up in Berlin and it's an hour's drive to Canada, then you might go over to Canada and buy your drugs. But people who live in Boston aren't going to do that. So this happens all the time, right? And the key thing to remember between the key things here with price discrimination is from the producer's perspective, the costs are identical, right? The marginal costs are identical. So MC Canada or MC US and MC Canada, MC US is equal to MC Canada, right? So there's no difference in the price paid by the company to produce it. So the company is just charging a different price based on your demand curve, based on each segment's demand curve. The US. So now we could, what we could do here instead is think about, so instead of thinking about the pharmaceutical industry and segmenting across countries, instead what you could think about is hospitals. So let's imagine Wentworth Douglas. So now we're going to get rid of the divide, the segmenting by geography. Think now instead of Wentworth Douglas, and you're going to go in for a minor surgery, like they're going to scope your knee, right? And it's a day surgery. You're going to go in. They're going to knock you out for an hour. They'll cut into your knee a little bit, take out some loose cartilage, close you back up. You go home. So the cost to Wentworth Douglas is some amount of money, right? So doing the surgery, it doesn't matter whether you have Cigna, Blue Cross, Medicare, or Medicaid. The cost, the marginal cost, right, is the same. But if you have private insurance, so say Harvard Pilgrim, right, that's as I understand it, that's one of the best paying. They pay well. So if you have Harvard Pilgrim as opposed to Medicaid, right? If you have Harvard Pilgrim, you are going to be less elastic, more inelastic in your demand. You are going to be more able to pay than if you are on Medicaid. So as a result, the hospital costs for doing the knee scope are the same, right? It costs the hospital, let's say, I don't know, $2,000 in supplies and manpower. But if you have Harvard Pilgrim, they're going to charge you $10,000 for the surgery. And if you have Medicaid, they're going to charge you $2,500, right? And as a result, what did I say, 2,000, right? So the cost is 2,000. Remember the profit, right? And so this is 10,000 if you're Harvard. So they make, and let's just say it's one visit each. So 2,000, 2,500, right? So the profit is the difference between the price paid and the cost times the number of units. So in this case, that would be 8,000, right? Because it's 10,000 minus 2,000 is 8,000. So they charge, they get $8,000 in excess profit. Over here, they charge $2,500 and get a profit of $500. Right? So they segment the market into those who can, and they charge different prices to different people. So this happens literally every day in every healthcare delivery environment. Right? And it is, so last time you went to the doctor and you sat in the waiting room, and next time you do, when you sit in the waiting room and look around, just realize that every single person in that room is probably paying a different price for the same services. Right? So let's see. So that is same example, right? So the key here is different ways of segmenting the market, and different markets are segmented in different ways. So if you're selling pharmaceuticals, you'll probably segment geographically. You could also maybe segment, if you're a pharmacy, you might sell different prices to different people as well. Let's see. So you could think about, just replacing here countries with insurance plans. That works. One of the cool examples is from, if you've, and maybe you've experienced this, is, going to buy airline tickets. So if this is time, right, and as we approach the departure date, if you're way back here, let's say 6 months out, your price might be here, right? And then as we get closer to the departure date, right, the price starts to climb. Because why? Well, if you're a vacationer, you're going to be probably planning your vacation several months out. But as we approach the departure date, business travelers tend not to plan their business travel all that far out. They just plan, they may be planning like the next week or the next day, or they may get a call and say, hey, you need to be here in Boston in 3 hours, get on a plane. If you're in New York, right? Or you need to be here tomorrow morning. And so as we approach the departure date, what airlines recognize is, that these are people who are more desperate. My grandmother, when I was stationed in Hawaii, my grandmother passed away. I don't have months I didn't have months to plan for that trip. So I had to, book a flight for the next day, immediately. And I probably paid twice as much as I normally would have paid, even with this so-called bereavement rate. I think we would pay like $600 to come home from, per ticket to come home from Hawaii, and I think they charged me over $1,000 for my flight. And they just know, I don't have a choice, right? And that's part of, right, when we talked about way back, right, what determines the steepness, the relative steepness of the demand curve. A major determinant in terms of the relative steepness is the number of substitutes available. So if you're trying to book a flight for the next day, the airline knows quite well that you do not have any substitutes, and so they charge you a very high price, right? So if this is kind of departure. Now, any of you guys ever booked a flight through Priceline, like the day before you were going to fly? Just curious if anybody's done that. I remember when that first came out, and I toyed with trying to do it, but I never had the flexibility because I couldn't afford, to like take leave and then, plan on, what if I don't get a flight? Then I'm screwed. No? Not the day before, but I've used Skyscanner only a week in advance. Okay, is that kind of the same thing? Like they've got these super low low cost flights that you don't get to pick anything, or is it just like? Okay, okay. So so like Priceline, as I understand it, I've never made it work for me. Is you put in a bid and you're like, it's the day before, it's the day before, and you want to fly. You're like, hey, you know what? I've got the free weekend. I'll fly to San Francisco for the weekend. What the heck? If I can get a cheap enough flight. So you go on Priceline, you put in, you're like, I want to fly from Boston to San Francisco. And they're like, well, how much are you willing to pay? And you put in, I'll pay $150 round trip. And then and they'll come back with something like, that's not a reasonable price, so it's not likely you'll get it. And you're like, yeah, well, and if I don't get it, I'll just stay in Boston. So then you put it in and you put, and the thing is, like with Priceline, my understanding is you can wind up, they guarantee that you'll get there the day of, but you might have to like fly at 6 a.m. And if you're going to San Francisco, you might have to like fly to, Miami and then stop in Dallas and then, and then from Dallas to San Francisco or something god awful like that. So you don't have any control on, the exact ticket arrangement that you get. You just get a promise that you'll be able to fly that day for that price. So what's interesting about that is you wind up with this bifurcation, right, where you can either go all the way in and pay the highest possible price that they would charge like to a business traveler, or, what they're doing with that, like with companies like Priceline is United Airlines will say, oh, shoot, we've got like 20 seats on this airplane for some reason, and we're going to fly regardless. We've got 150 people on here, but we can sit 170. So we're going to fly regardless. But you know what? We'd rather sell, it costs us the marginal cost of adding those last 20 people. The marginal cost of those last 20 people is maybe, $20 per head. So as long as we could charge anything more than $20, we may as well sell the ticket. But we're not going to sell it through our regular distribution channels. We're going to sell it through Priceline, because if we sold it through our regular distribution channels, our business travelers would snap those up. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to sell it through Priceline. So there's like this bifurcation, right? Meaning that it breaks into two, options. So you still get the business traveler up here, right, paying this really high price, and then the super flexible elastic traveler, right, vacation traveler most likely, because they don't have any. Because you've got to, like I said, with when you're negotiating a car, if you're offering to fly on Priceline, you've got to be prepared to not get the flight. And so people who choose to try to book through Priceline, usually their alternative is to not fly, right? And they don't care, because if they really cared, they'd pay the full price. So I think that's kind of interesting. This is time. You can think about this though, from a healthcare perspective, right? If you get sick, you're having chest pain, and it feels like an elephant is sitting on your chest. And I know you guys are too young to worry about that, but I'm getting into that zone now. So if you're having chest pain, you're going to go to the ED, whether you're not going to be like, oh, I wonder how much this will cost. You're going to be like, I'm going to die if I don't go to the ED. And so, the ED has the possibility of extracting an extraordinarily high price out of you. So that is actually one of the arguments for both not-for-profit hospitals, the idea being that a not-for-profit hospital wouldn't price gouge you. And two, it's for health insurance, because the health insurance pre-negotiates the price for you, so that if you need an ED visit, the price is preset, as opposed to when you show up, the ED decides how much they're going to charge you. So like, when you're standing there like, I can't breathe, and you're holding your chest, and now you're negotiating with the, with the emergency department on how much you're going to charge you for the care, they'd be able to extract, even more, an even higher price. So, from a healthcare perspective, it's the same kind of idea of, segmentation. Another common example is hard copy versus soft copy books. I don't know if any of you have a preference for hardcover or not hard copy, hardcover books. I mean, I've always kind of thought, hey, they kind of look cool. I'm kind of a book hound. I have tons of books. They kind of look cool, but they're always like twice as expensive. So, as it turns out, and your chapter talks about this, this is one of the ways that publishers engage in price discrimination, right? How does hardcover versus softcover books allow the publisher to engage in price discrimination? If you assume that a hardcover book is essentially the same product as a softcover book, which you can, if you're a kind of person that cares about or has a fetish for hardcover books, which I confess to having a little bit of. So how do publishers use hardcover versus softcover? Yeah, so they're a little nicer, right? They cost a little more, prettier. Yep. I agree with you. I think they're prettier. So let me kind of give the point. Yes. So Catherine Gallagher, yes. So they're the way that publishers work it is they release the book in hardcover first, and they hit up and they charge a higher price, notionally taking advantage of people like Sam and I who like hardcover, but also they justify charging the higher price because it's hardcover. But really what they're doing is they're discriminating between the super fans again and the just kind of average fans, right? So if you're a what's her name that wrote Harry Potter, right? If you're a Harry Potter, you're passionate about Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling, thank you. If you're a Rowling fan and Rowling comes out with, the latest Harry Potter world book, you are going to run down to the store and pay $25 for a hardcover copy of the book. The rest of us who are like, yeah, J.K. Rowling's cool, like Harry Potter, no, not in any big rush to get the book. The rest of us will wait for this. We'll wait for the softcover to come out, and we'll pay $12.95 for it as opposed to $25. Right? And so basically, they use the hardcover, softcover as a way to segment the market. All right. If you've ever taken Uber, right? Depending on where you're going, they can engage in surge pricing is a way of segmenting. Let's see. All right, I want to do a demo. Well, let me talk. I'm going to do a demo, and then I'm going to talk about perfect price discrimination, and then I'll do a demo. All right. So we've talked about we've got our demand curve, we've got our marginal revenue, right? And if we assume marginal cost, constant marginal cost, right, we're just able to, we've got our price, we've got our quantity, and so let's imagine that we've got, say, marginal cost of 3. The result here is, our inverted demand curve is P equals 21 minus 3/2. Q, our total cost is 3Q, so therefore our marginal cost is 3, right? Our price of 21 minus 3Q gives us a total revenue function of 21Q minus 3 over 2Q squared, which gives us a marginal revenue of 21 minus 3Q, right? Which then gives us, if you solve for this, you wind up with a quantity of 6, a price of 12, and I'll leave you to do this later. The monopolist winds up collecting, right? The monopolist earns monopolist gets this much in revenue, right? The monopolist costs are here. So 3 times 6 is their cost, right? They wind up with this as their profit. And then the consumer gets consumer surplus of, let's say this is 21, right? Because the price is 21. So the consumer surplus, let's see, total revenue then. Total revenue is a price of 12 times a quantity of 6. So total revenue is 12 times 6, which is 72. Total cost is 3 times 6, which is 18. So we wind up with a profit of 72 minus 18, which is 54, right? Consumer surplus up here is the triangle between, with a height of 21 minus 12, which is 9, right, times the width of 6 times a half gives us 27, right? We have this deadweight loss that we don't collect, right? And in a competitive market, we would actually be all the way out here where marginal cost equals price. So that we would solve by setting marginal cost of 3 equal to price 21 minus 3 over 2Q, right? Which gives us 12. Right, so this would be 12 would be the competitive outcome. So as a result of this being a monopolist and them having market power, they reduce quantity from 12 to 6, right? And they raise price from 3 up to 12. The result is that half of what could be produced in the market is held back. Now, wouldn't it be a better thing if we got 12 units of the product out into the market, right? So instead of 6 million copies of J.K. Rowling's latest book, we'd get 12 million copies out, right? And if you looked at, right, the demand curve down to the total quantity would be the total social good that's created, right? But right now we're only producing 6, so the total social good is limited to right here. So society is not as well off if at 6 as it would be at 12. Well, price discrimination allows us to get to 12. And here's how it works. Perfect price discrimination. We've still got the same demand curve, and so this actually touches at 14, 21, marginal cost of 3, right? So the firm that engages in perfect price discrimination, and this would not be a bookseller, but instead would be something like the university, right? So the university engages in near perfect price discrimination. And so what they do is they identify, so there's, and so this is the competitive outcome of 12. So let's say that they've got room we've got room at the university for 12,000 students. That's actually pretty close. Let's say that we can segment the market into units of 1,000. Let's say that the first 1,000 students are all from wealthy families. And so we charge them 21, so kind of the area, it's starting at 21 and going out to 1, we would calculate the area underneath the curve, inclusive of the little tip there, right? We would charge the first group, the price they would pay would be this, the area under this curve, whatever that would be, right? The next group, also pretty wealthy, but not as wealthy as the first group, right? We would charge them this much, right? And then the next group, the third group, who's a little less wealthy than the first group, right? We would charge the area under the between 2 and 3 under the curve, we would charge them this much. And then the fourth group, I think you maybe are getting my point, I hope, right? We would charge them this much on down the line, right, until we got to 12. And so the university wouldn't charge $3 if this was a competitive market. The university would charge a price of $3 to everybody. What they do instead is they charge different prices to each student, right, up to the maximum that they would be willing to pay. So they absorb. What happens is we wind up filling in, I'm just going to use my marker here. We fill in the whole top, right? We charge, just fill in the university collects all of this as their revenue. So in the under monopoly, they would collect this much as their revenue, right? And then this much would be cost, right? So they would collect this much as revenue. This bit would be left for the students as consumer surplus. So this would be your consumer surplus, right? Under monopoly pricing. Under perfect price discrimination, where they know exactly how much you're willing to pay, they will charge you exactly the amount that you're willing to pay. You will have zero consumer surplus. They will have charged you exactly what you were willing to pay for to come to the university. Their costs, so they will collect in revenue this whole area, right? Becomes their revenue. Their costs are the bottom part here, right? Because marginal cost equals average total cost. So under perfect price discrimination, the total revenue is the area, is the whole area under the demand curve and to the left of the competitive quantity. So that's going to be equal to the rectangle, which is 12 times 3 is 36, plus the triangle, which is 18 times 12 times a half, which is 108, for a total of 144. So their revenues are 144. Their total costs, again, are just the 36. It's this area, this rectangle. So their total costs are 36. So their profit is the 108. So they wind up absorbing all of the consumer surplus, and the consumer surplus becomes the the profits for the organization that is capable of perfect price discrimination. Now, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Well, I would argue it's actually a good thing, because of what I just said a minute ago. Would it be better for society to have 6 units? Let's say this is education, since we're still, would it be better for society to have 6,000 educated kids with bachelor's degrees, or 12,000 kids with bachelor's degrees? And I would say the answer is probably 12,000, right? How do we get that? Well, we get that by engaging in perfect price discrimination. And so, but what happens is the university winds up absorbing all of the excess consumer surplus, so all of the happiness that you would have gotten out of, and all of the excess earnings, it actually is probably more a better point of what you would have gotten had you gone under a different scheme. They're able to charge you, higher prices because you're looking down the line saying, I'm going to be able to make more money if I get a college degree. So they charge you a lot of money now, and they charge you less, they charge you a lot of money now. Now, that said, right, they extract all your consumer surplus. So you're getting this product at exactly what you value it at. So if you got it, if you paid 21 for it, let's say that's 21,000 for it, that's what you valued it for. So you got something worth 21,000 and you paid 21,000. That's not a terrible thing, but you're not excited about it. You'd be excited about it if you got something that you valued at 21,000 and you paid 12,000 for it, right? Which is this situation. So the amount of excitement you have is kind of your consumer surplus. When an organization successfully extracts all of your consumer surplus, you tend not to be as happy with that organization. You're happy you got what you got, but you don't feel like you got a bargain, okay? All right, I've got something I want to show you. I want to show you a quantitative version of this. So I will take a couple of minutes, I guess, on Monday to just run an Excel version to show you, why is price discrimination good? Even this, just the basic segmenting price discrimination, where we distinguish between two different abilities to pay, and I think it might make it a little clearer to you. So I'll do that on Monday. It won't take me very long. I'm just going to demo it. I might even make a video of it and post it, so that way you can reference it later. Okay, so all right, that's time. So so for Monday, you should be doing the Chapter 14 LEAP pad. I have problems for chapters 8, 10, 11, and 12, practice problems up on the web. On Canvas, I will have 13 and 14 up as soon as I can. We will do a review session at 2 on Sunday, kind of optional. Don't have to come if you don't feel like it, but I'll just run through problems for you on Sunday. Monday's class will be just review. Wednesday's class will be exam time. And I will let you know exactly what the format it will be for that. It will be some sort of Canvas-based thing. I may allow you to upload a document to show me your work as well. I haven't figured out how to do that just yet. So I'm going to think about that this weekend, and I'll let you know no later than Monday's class. All right. Thank you for your time. Be safe out there. Take care of yourselves and your friends and your family. And, reach out to me if you need anything. And